Okay, we should be live now. I'm gonna double check on YouTube that everything is good, and then I'll start everything. Okay, it does look like that we are good. Okay, hey everyone, welcome to the live stream. This is the first time I'm doing a live stream, so hopefully it goes well today. We do have Jim Bonner on today. You want to say hi, Jim?
Hey, what's going on?
And Jim just recently published a book. I'm going to read from the author's introduction of the book here, or his biographical information, just so you guys have a little bit of background about who Jim is. So Jim Bonner is a father and husband who was born and raised and currently lives in Texas. After graduating with a Bachelor of Science degree in both history and political science, he has found employment in the field of statistical analysis. Since 2019, Jim has been involved in dissident organizations to build and organize local communities for our people. He is the author of Interbellum, a play in two acts, along with other fiction and nonfiction works, which have been published by Ansel Hill in the Why We Fight anthology, in the Biz Archives, in the Firstness Journal, and alongside Bronze Age Pervert, Mencius Moldbug, and Ending Bigley. So, Jim, welcome to the live stream.
It's really great to be here. I've been looking forward to this all week, actually.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, this should be fun. So, you have a new book that you just published called Compendious Visions: Discourses on Contemporary Decline. Can you give the sort of, I guess, the 10,000-foot view of what this book is about and what you try to do with this book?
So the goal of the book is to try to get a orthodoxy among our communities, among our movement, if you will, and to try to make it to where there's a foundation from which actual in real life persons can build communities from the foundation of the philosophical foundation of the book. On top of that, it's also trying to work its way through from a ontological starting point for any people who are recently coming around to these sort of ideas that are a little bit out of the public awareness. So it starts from an ontological point of view, starts stepping through human nature, history, and then gets specific with European history all the way up to about the 1800s, where afterwards I start looking at the modern world and some of its characteristics. Um, and that's where we get a little bit more in depth, but it's also has other aspects to it, like um, a take on morality, um, and a take on a hypothetical political system. It's kind of like a LARP constitution in one of the appendices. So it's got trying to be as comprehensive as possible, while also staying as a summary, because I'm not really equipped to do something that's truly comprehensive. I don't think I am able to do something as in depth as all these subjects deserve, but because I feel like because I have a sort of apocalyptic time scale that I feel like we're working on here, I wanted to just try to get as much of this stuff into one book as possible that could be as informative as possible, so that way some sort of action can come out of it. And that's what the compendious part of the title is. It's compendious just means to summarize totality, which is what I try to do with the book, and try to just get our circle's ideas in a completely summarized packet.
Yeah, I mean, from that aspect, it's sort of like a manifesto in a lot of ways. I don't want. I know that has certain like political implications, but would you call it like a manifesto?
Yeah, I honestly would, and some of the first drafts started more or less as as an overt manifesto, so I think that that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, because you do like as you said, this is not like a hard to read book. I mean, you can finish it really if you wanted to, like in like a one or two sittings, really. But I say that in a good way, not in a dismissive way. It's very because you do touch on a lot of topics, and it is very interesting because there's always topics. But of course, whole, there's paragraphs that whole like books could be written about here, but that's not really your goal here exactly.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I don't really know where to start with this because there is like, as I just said, there's a huge width that this book has. So one thing that I find sort of interesting is sort of anthropology in the sense of political anthropology. Like, what is the sort of basis of human society? And you in your book, you kind of make the argument that it's not the sort of liberal idea that the individual is at the basis of human society, but rather it's a more sort of collectivistic unit of society. Am I characterizing you right?
No, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah. And do you want to sort of like elaborate on that? Like, what is your sort of political anthropology that you lay out in the book?
So this is more towards the start of the book, and it gets expanded on, and it's kind of like a measurement for a lot of different other aspects that I talk about later on, especially in regards to the modern world. But the starting point for my political anthropology or my views on human nature are that human beings are a social predator. And I don't mean that in any sort of Darwinistic or materialistic sense. I just mean that from an observational point of view. We share the same characteristics with other predators and those that specifically are inclined to social behavior. So from that, I think it's virtually impossible to do like what you were talking about, approach society or human nature or reality from an individualistic point of view. Because if we are inherently social predators, then um, it would necessarily forego that conclusion. And also from that, I mean, there's three main characteristics that I view from that central assumption or observation, whatever you want to go by there. But it's that human beings, you know, on a purely materialistic level, one of the goals would be to reproduce. And then on a more political or social level, there's the highest possible standard would be warfare. And then on an even deeper level, where we are cognizant of reality that really makes human beings separate from simply animals, would be the religious aspect, where we're seeking out spirituality or beauty or God. So those three characteristics stem from our nature as a social predator.
And then, like, what do you think about what do you think is like the sort of basis of society? Then, if it's not the individual, what do you think is the sort of smallest unit you could deduce society to, or deduce sort of humanity to?
I mean, from that, it would have to be a family. I mean, if you want to get into like hypotheticals or scenarios, I mean, it's reality started with a man and a woman. The family's the natural locus for the social life, and from that you have structures that build that are like tribes, which seem to be the natural extension of the family, at least in a historical perspective. I mean, not everywhere invented civilized places or city states or anything like that, but almost everywhere at one point in time had a tribal system. And the tribe is built like cells in a molecule, or sorry, excuse me, like atoms in a molecule. And the family builds the tribe.
Yeah, me personally, I personally take the sort of view that Dugan lays out in his ethno-sociological works, where he says that the basis of society, he goes a step further, saying it's not the individual, obviously, it's not the family, but he says it's like the clan, and he says the sort of way that these it's not just Dugan's ideas, it's like Lev Gumilyov's, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I think it's his idea originally that the basis of humanity, the smallest unit, is sort of like the ethnos, but within the ethnos, you have to have two clans because just looking at it from an empirical point of view, these ethnoses, they always, whenever you want to marry somebody, you always have to marry someone like across the river, so to speak. Like you have to marry someone from the other clan because of
Mm,
like these incest things that come about, where you sort of have these two, at least two clans. You can have more, obviously, but at minimum, two clans make the ethnos, and the ethnos is the basis of human society and civilization, and it just evolves, changes from there. And so, it's not the family, he argues, but rather it's the clan is the sort of smallest unit. But even then, you make it even a bigger argument and saying it's actually the ethnos. But I still think that you do a good job here, basically destroying this sort of liberal notion that it's the individual that makes up society. This notion that didn't even really exist until like Thomas Hobbes, maybe like the 15
right,
1600s, right?
right, yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
pretty historically unprecedented.
Yeah. And there's no like empirical evidence for this. And it doesn't even make sense on a sort of rational basis, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean, like even, I mean, if you look at it like genetically or memetically, like there's no way that there can be an individual. And especially when you want to tie it into other enlightenment ideas, where it's like not only are is reality able to be interceded by the individual, but it's also everyone is equal at the same time, or there is at least some sort of political equality. I think that those two notions are like as separate units untenable, but also together it's just completely contradictory.
And then they get into theories about how society is like a contractual thing. Everyone, it's like social contract theory where everyone, according to it's in their rational best interest as mere individuals to come into society. When society, as you said, we're like these predator species, right? Society is not built off, contracts. Society is built off blood. Society's built off, conquest. Society's built off, myths, not contracts.
Right. Yeah. That's how I feel, and that's what I've tried to lay out in the first few chapters of the book is that there can't be like for the tribal structure there cannot be a sense for the tribe to base its identity off. There is nothing for the tribe to base its identity off of if each individual is having their own perspective. It has to appeal to some sort of higher level of understanding, some sort of authority that's even beyond the chieftain or beyond the collective as it understands itself. There has to be something for the collective to be actualized, for it to even be such, and that's where the spirituality comes into play in our human nature. That's what we use to sort of give parameters to reality, and in doing so it gives a shape to our own individual and collective identities where we can actually act because we've taken care of these um, more abstract questions.
So today we're not in the world, we're not in like, a million or thousands of these sort of tribes or ethnoses. What do you see the current sort of state of collectivity, I guess, is as a way to put it. Like, where do you currently see that at right now? If we're not in a bunch of tribes in these, small, tribes under like, 400 people, where do you see us at right now?
I mean I honestly kind of see it from an individualist point of view. I think it's kind of a meme or a myth that kind of generated its own conclusions. I mean, once you, especially when there are, economic and political systems like capitalism or democracy that reinforce that the individual is the sole arbiter of reality and its own interests, then it reinforces that aspect and it kind of creates it in and of itself. I mean, I do see that the world is more individualistic, less connected, less spiritual than it has ever been in its history. Um, and I don't see that changing except through the sheer willpower of um, like what a similar class of people who originally created civilization, like some sort of burgeoning priest class that could come out of our current situation because they do have the willpower, they do have the understanding, whereas everyone else is kind of mired in these unanswerable questions about themselves, about reality, and so I do see the current situation that we face globally as individualism. Uh, but I don't think that the way out of it is necessarily just collectivization as that term. I think that there does have to be a spiritual aspect which comes into play just like it did originally.
And can you elaborate on the sort of spiritual aspect you sort of envision? Like, what do you think is necessary?
Um, I think if it honestly I'm not sure, but I think if it was that simple, we probably would have already won at this point
Fair enough.
against those systems. But um, I'm not sure what method it will take, but I do think that perhaps the most useful one would be to put ourselves in the situations with other people locally in collectives, and I think that it will emerge organically. Um, I I do think that it's necessary to maintain the parameters of those collectives, but hopefully through this book there is at least a little bit of a foundation for some sort of spiritual consensus to be already present when people start to organize locally.
I know like a lot of people in our sort of movement, even those who aren't even people who are like total atheist, admit that if it came to it, they could like force themselves to believe in a sort of like social myth and a sort of like social religion, which is interesting because I don't think that. And tell me what you think about this, but I don't think that you can. I think you already said this actually that you can't have a society without a sense of sort of spirituality because our societies are built on myths, archetypes, whatever. They're built on these sort of things that we can't see with that we can't measure with science or our scientific materials. They're built off these irrational or non-rational perhaps or even irrational myths. They're built off things that we can't see, these intangible things that are a part of us but that we can't necessarily measure with like calipers or something like that. So what role I don't know what I'm trying to ask you, but I guess um like how do you think this is going to have to manifest? Like do you think it's going to have to be like a specific like Christianity, or do you think it's going to be more like a sort of like social myth that we'll have to create?
I don't see it. I think that people instinctively are averse to like the social myth thing because it's there's an aspect where people like intuitively understand that it's kind of made up, whereas more like grounded religious things are tapping into something deeply deeply human, like almost beyond human. And I think that it would be more in the latter direction, more like religious than like socially constructed. But I do also, I don't know if it will be specifically Christianity or anything like that, or I don't know if there's something new on the horizon that will take the reins of this. I just honestly don't know, but I do know that there has to be some sort of consensus ahead of time about what reality constitutes for anything like that to materialize. Because if you do try to craft something within the context of the modern world, like you do try to craft like a social contract, a spiritual social contract, then it's going to be um, affected by the same conditions that you're hoping that it will help you escape from by creating a new collectivization. So I think it will have to be like on the other side of some liminal event, but unless the condition preconditions are met ahead of time, I don't think it will materialize.
I know like things ideas like pluralism, right? This idea that we can all sort of agree to disagree, because we tried this after World War II, at least in America. There was an attempt to make this sort of like liberal consensus, not like liberal in the sense of like a classical liberal consensus of like individual rights, freedom of speech, capitalism with maybe some regulations and stuff to it, but not communism and stuff like that. But then you get into sort of problems of like Karl Popper mentions like the paradox of tolerance, where the only way to have the consensus of agree to disagree is that you have to kick out those who have these sort of transcendental worldviews that are exclusionary, right?
Right.
So I think that the sort of idea that you can have multiple consensus in society, it's just not possible. Like we've tried it every time we tried it, it just doesn't work. And then you have to, exclude people who don't agree with your consensus that there is no consensus, right? And that becomes its own sort of paradox in of itself.
Right, right. And I think it's similar to like a if you want to treat the collective consciousness similar to an individual consciousness, then it's similar to a form of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder for the collective. And it's just inherently going to make it inoperable to do what it needs to do to survive, to provide for its own members, to propagate it, and so forth. And I think the number one prerogative for any sort of civilized group is to maintain order. I don't see the in terms of history, I don't see any sort of precedent for civilization to be providing for liberties or to um, account for rights or things like that. I see it only as a way to maintain order, and the only way to do that is to make sure that there is a consensus. And I think that that doesn't necessarily have to be reinforced with a rod, although you do need that eventually, and so it is necessary. But I don't think that that has to be the first reaction. I think that the first reaction is to benevolently um, raise people up according to that consensus. And this is sort of something that Plato touches upon in the Republic, is that he talks about making a sort of benevolent myth for his society. But I do think that he's trying to touch upon something that was extinct in his city state in Athens at that point in time, but which he knew was from a more primordial era, which was that you do need this priest class who to orchestrate the collective consciousness, to be kind of like the the what's the right way to put this, like the brain in the organ of the brain in the collective body, to filter information so that way people aren't mired by 1,000 points of view. I think that without that, there can't be a society, or civilized society, I should say, that can um, create order. And if it can't create order, then its time is ticking quickly.
There's this idea that comes from Giovanni Gentile, this idea of totalitarianism, which, thanks to like Hannah Arendt, has been a word that has become basically a slur, in the same way that Noam Chomsky made the word corporatism also a slur. And it's this idea that Giovanni Gentile, for instance, the sort of like philosopher of fascism, his main concern was, or one of his main concerns was, the philosophy of education. And that's why when he was in Mussolini's government, he was like the head of education, and he radically reformed the Italian educational system. And what he believed is what he called like a pedagogical state, in the sense that it's like the state's job to make the sort of mind of the state and the mind of all of the people into one, to make it a totality, in order to create order. Like, is that, are you talking about something like that, or what do you think about that?
I do think something similar to that. I do think something similar to that. I would disagree with the like Italian fascist way of treating the state. I don't think that the way that the state was treated as kind of a substitute for religion, I don't think that that is necessarily ideal. It may be better than the liberal status quo of the post Enlightenment world, but I do think that what would be more ideal is to totally break away from the post Enlightenment frame, and to try to, if not recreate, then use as a basis to that same primordial arrangement that Plato was thinking about when he wrote the Republic. Even though his sort of subversive, uh, kind of, it's almost Masonic the way that he wants to like undermine society to create a better society. But I think that going back to as primordial as possible means that those conditions are more universally applicable than would be otherwise, and by that they are more organic and therefore more sustainable long term.
I know Plato, like one interesting sort of read of Plato, his political career, is that, he saw his teacher Socrates die due to basically what was like a liberal democracy, and it's not in the way we understand it, but in those times it was kind of that way. And then you could basically see like the Republic of him just being angry, and basically writing a system that says there will never be a death of Socrates again. That's interesting read. It's an interesting lens in which you can sort of read a lot of Plato's thought, which is an interesting way to think about it, in my opinion. But so when you talk about like civilization, like you talk about like I know you've written, I think it's in the Firstness Journal, which I think it is Joel Davis, or isn't is he involved in that in somewhere?
Yeah, he's the editor.
Yeah, okay. And Joel Davis is a good guy, and he's, one of our like top intellectuals, along with like, Keith Woods and a couple other our guys, in my opinion.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then you talk about the sort of, you talked about the Egyptian civilization, and how one of the reasons that Egypt was basically allowed to last like thousands of years, quite literally, was the fact that it emphasized order. So what sort of lessons about order do you think that we should take in trying to create a new future, or like
I
order and
think
civilization, generally speaking?
I think well, there's also another problem that I bring up in regards to order in that article that I wrote for the Firstness Journal, is that there's people talk about like a cyclical version of history where you have the hard times create tough men sort of cycle. But I see it more as like a siphoning awareness of, or not awareness, but a siphoning of a political authority where you have on the in one era you will have like a federal, like what we would call a federal today, or like a centralized, that's the word I was looking for. Like you have a centralized authority that manages a lot of localities, and then when it collapses, almost inevitably, the localities have to um, pick up the political authority that the central authority had dissipated in its collapse. So you have these two conflicting, kind of undulating interests historically, of locality and centrality, and who's going to be able to secure order better. And so I think historically you have to respect the locality to better maintain order. And that goes back to my views on human nature as well, because I do think that being social predator, and with an emphasis on the family aspect of that, or the tribal aspect, then the locality is more organic in terms of our mindset and our interests. So we're able to affect that much better than we would on the aggregate, on the central level, or the federal level, whatever. And so I think that that needs to be emphasized. But at the same time, whenever one of those localities is able to, um, through whatever mean, confederation or conquest, assert itself above other localities, then you do have a central authority. So how do you balance those two historical prerogatives? Like
Yeah,
I don't
even
know if
like
it,
this is even like a biblical thing, right? If we look at like say Joseph in Egypt, where he helped sort of centralize the Egyptian state to deal with the upcoming famine, but then that powerful Egyptian state then put the Jews in slavery and whatnot, right? So there is this sort of like and this is even like a Jungian thing, and I know Jordan Peterson in his before he sort of went off the deep end in these sort of like cringe kind of like classical liberal conservative politics. He in his book Maps of Meaning, he emphasizes this a lot, how there needs to be like a sort of like dialectical, in order like the best society is like where there's a dialectical synthesis between order and chaos, between like order, like you need order but you can't have too much of it, and you need individuality, you need chaos, you need like freedom or whatever, but you can't have too much of it. You have to be able to balance that, and balancing that is the sort of civilizational, like if you want to have a meta view of history, one meta view of history you can have is the struggle between this sort of order and chaos.
I could agree with that. Yeah. And depending on which like prerogative is active at that time, whether it's like the central power has collapsed or the locality is being subjugated, I think that the emphasis on which one is order and which one is chaos can take on, it takes on different roles depending on which era that cycle is in.
And I think another problem that we have in the modern world is that it's the nation state. I forgot who said it, but the nation state is too big to deal with big problems, but too small to deal with small problems. So we get this. So you don't. So like with a city state, right? A city state is pretty good at micromanaging like a city. City planning. Doing all these sort of like little things, listening to, um, you know, able to have some form of like true democracy in the sense like the people's voice as a sort of even like Rousseauian general will was able to be realized, but it's not necessarily good at defending against larger nations or larger empires or whatever. However, the nation state can't really do that, and it's not really good at having a sort of civilizational projection. So it can't really micromanage well, but nor can it have a sort of civilizational virility to it.
Yeah, I would agree with that to a certain extent. Yeah, I would, but I to counterpoint slightly, the nation also helps the localities from being at constant war with each other, or for one to assert itself to the role of like a despot, where it's not any sort of like benevolent order that's being projected. It's just complete. It's almost like hateful, kind of like like if you get conquered, then you're just at that other person's mercy, and you have all these localities who, if they do get conquered by one of the stronger localities, then it's over for them, and all of that different culture, different resources they could have uh, utilized for their own benefit are now just aggregated to this other person. I do think the nation state, no, it doesn't resolve that for sure. It doesn't resolve that, but it does help better balance the localities with a centrality. Um, Although I do know that the downsides that you're talking about are very apparent.
Well, I think sort of these empires do a better job at that. Like I think if you can combine the empire with locality, they think that's the sort of like best situation where you have these empires that can be a sort of civilizational unit on the world scale, but they also you can relegate these localities to various sort of principalities within your civilization to deal with their own like internal affairs while having a more or less unified like foreign policy.
Right. Okay. I got you. I got you. Yeah. Yeah. And that's honestly something that I tried to touch upon in the appendix, where I have the the LARP constitution, where I try to balance that in the way that you're talking about, but only through totalitarianism can that be balanced.
Yeah, I think you need both like authoritarianism in the sense that, in the Schmittian sense, in the sense that you need someone who can make decisions and isn't bogged down in democracy in the bad sense, democracy as a sort of like voting where two parties compete with each other, or a multi-party system where nothing really gets done. You need that. You need the sovereign who can act outside of the laws to save the laws in a decisive way. But you also need the sort of Gentilian totalitarianism where all of society, even if you have all these various principalities on a civilizational level, you can have a unified people in the sense that you might have, Athens, Sparta, and all these other city states, but when the Persians come, it's like a one struggle.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Yes. And they can
So
they can mobilize more efficiently.
yeah, and then but you also talk about some other things as well that I found pretty interesting here. So like you do talk about democracy, and you actually cite quite a bit from Hans Hermann Hoppe, which I found really interesting. But another thing that I you talk about is what it means to be civilized, and it's sort of, I guess, I don't want to say conservative, but the only way I know how to put it is like a conservative or like right wing critique of capitalism and the sort of excess of comforts that we have.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely. I'm definitely not trying to. So I do my critique of capitalism is more from a historical point of view rather than um like a Marxist or any sort of point of view, excuse me,
Sure.
like that. It's it's more as a, to me, the foundation is that the market was never historically left to its own devices. It always had something that was keeping it in check, whether that was the the state itself or the guilds or something to that effect. And for it to be almost completely let loose is a historically unprecedented event. And with that comes all these different, like, because it's so historically unprecedented, because rather than acting with society, it sort of overtakes society because it's allowed to do anything it wants. It excuse me, it becomes completely antithetical to social ends. And it's like I said earlier on in the interview, it reinforces the individuality that it postulates in the first place, which is again historically unprecedented. And it makes the ability to maintain civilization, the order that comes with it makes it more difficult because there are so many conflicting interests operating in society.
Yeah, and then it also, I would argue, sort of takes up upon a logic of its own where people succumb to it without even realizing that they succumb to it as well, where all sort of decisions have to be increasingly they become monetized. Like once you introduce like money into society, there's it's really hard to sort of go back from that. And now more and more things, interactions with people that were done on a either a symbolic level or like in like a symbolic level, like a friendship level of friendship or obligation, all that gets destroyed with the idea of like monetization, the idea of inserting money or capital into your society. So now instead of doing something out of like obligation or out of love, you now have to do it like out of money.
Right, right. And even more so that because it's the money has become the like the quintessential unit of reality for society. um it has to be uniform, like things have to be completely like measurable in the same way. So you have, and because there are because it's trying to operate for profit, it's going to reduce the quality of products um to be as what would you say, advertisable to the lowest common denominator, which like I said, decreases the quality of the products because it has to be mass produced through industrialization. Like capitalism can only come about through industrialization, so it's really related to that in a lot of ways.
And also like urbanization as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the factory has to be, it has to be a thing for capitalism to work, and you can't have a factory in the without urbanization.
One thing that I was thinking about with capitalism is how it basically turns upside down our cosmological view. Like what it so capitalism makes it gives us consistency where we're supposed to have inconsistency, but it makes things that we're supposed to have consistent be inconsistent. So when it comes to who you're going to be, what your job is, things that used to be set in stone through like, feudalism and things like that. I'm not saying I endorse feudalism, but there were sort of societal constructions that made it so you knew who you were. You had your sort of place in society. Capitalism destroys that and makes that uncertain. However, it makes things like I guess one of the things that I thought it was like waking up, right? It used to, you woke up according to like whenever the sun came out, or you all these little things that were somewhat random in your life, but now all of those things are made certain in your life, and it basically turns topsy turvy our whole like cosmological structure of society, and it did that basically overnight, and we just like let it happen.
Right, and it's because yes, yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. I I see it as like malevolent a malevolent force on our collective consciousness, and it's all because of what you were saying earlier about profit. It's done at the behest of these entities, these corporations, what have you, who have been able to accumulate as much capital as possible, as much money as possible, and then exert it to enforce their will. Whereas before in history, that would have been um, less likely. It would, because you do have the authoritative figurehead who can stop that. But when the foundational unit of society is money because of the market, then it's
And also
impossible
it
to
used to
stop
be
that.
that those who had power had money, but now it's who has money has power.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because it used to be
Absolutely.
if you were the king, you got you collected the rents, you collected the taxes, and then therefore you had money. But now that's not necessarily the case. If you're the president, like the president's salary is like, next to nothing when it comes to, business people, or at least, people who actually make money. The president's salary is really next to nothing, but it's the people who make billions of dollars who can influence the political rather than the political having control over capital. And I don't think either me or want to say, oh, we need to go to like a communist society where there is no money whatsoever, or some sort of like anarcho communism, or something like that. Like I do acknowledge that capitalism, when it comes to producing stuff, capitalism is pretty good at producing stuff. However, I think as a society, we could say, okay, we only need so much stuff.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that there is a way to dislocate capitalism from industrialization. You can be industrial and create the goods or services. You can have that arranged to where there is not such an excess and there is not such a prerogative to create low quality products. I do believe that there is a way to where you can have, to me, the foundation is that you just have to say that there's something above the market, that there's something that should keep the market in check, and that's the foundation. And from that, you can extrapolate just about anything. But for there to be something beyond it, that's necessary.
Yeah, it's like if it means I have to pay more for something in order to live in like a society, then I'm okay with that. Like if that's the price, if I have to pay more for my goods and services, but I get to live in an actual society where people aren't killing themselves over like deaths of despair, then I think that's a price. I think it's a worthy price to pay.
I'd agree. I'd agree.
But I think that I
And
know that triggers a lot of people in our circles who are. I don't want to drop any names or anything, but there are some people, especially online, who are like these like racist liberals, so to speak, right? Where they basically want the America we have now, but they want to be able to go into a McDonald's without seeing a brown person, and maybe they would like restrict pornography.
right, it's a very to me, it's a very limited view. I mean, when there are so many more possibilities, I don't know why you would want just such a simple
And it
definition
really
of
shows like
reality.
capitalism has only been around for the past 100 years. Humans have been around for whatever your anthropology is, at least 6,000 years if you're like a young Earth creationist or whatever, right? So
Right.
it's only been like a fraction of our time on this planet has been under capitalism. Yet these people think that this is the only way forward, or this is the only thing that's good.
Yeah, I think that if you don't cut the umbilicus between whatever goal that you're reaching for, whatever society that you're trying to create, if you don't cut the umbilicus between that and capitalism, it's going to wind up the same way as our society, because the market will overtake anything else that you let it, and you'll wind up right back to this point.
And also, there's really no such thing as a free market. Like there are markets that are free to do whatever they want. However, that is by like a downward authority. All economies are planned. The question is who's doing the planning, and a lack of a controlled economy is how the economy is controlled. FYI, like the fact that the government makes a conscious decision not to micromanage the economy is a decision.
Correct, and it shows where their interests are, and who is actually pulling the strings.
And then you make this other interesting distinction between machine and tool. And you draw on quite a few thinkers, it seems like. Do you want to sort of like talk about your sort of views on like technology and perhaps what our relationship should be to it?
Yeah, sure. I would say I'd probably influenced mostly by Theodore Kaczynski and Chad Haig in terms of industrialization. Um, but to me, the biggest difference between the tool machine distinction is that for a tool you need to have inherent knowledge of how you're going to use it, in terms of like you need a skill set, what we call. Or but with a machine, you just need to know how to operate the machine. So in that way, it creates a bubble of sorts where our knowledge or interactions with reality become reliant on the intermediary forces of technology. And those, like, technology in a lot of ways creates like matrices of knowledge that kind of obstruct our view of reality, because of direct knowledge, or because of direct interactions. We only get secondary or third hand knowledge through the technology itself. So whereas with the tool, you use it, and whereas in a kind of quasi poetically way, the other ways that the machine uses you to take care of itself.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think yeah, like a tool becomes part of you and it becomes like a sort of extension of you and it helps you achieve your goals, whereas the machine uses you to achieve its goals. It sort of has its own teleology is created. Would you say that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I don't think there's any problem inherently. I'm not saying go out there and like smash factories, but I mean if you want to, whatever. No, no, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. But we do need to like evaluate our. I think we do need to evaluate our relationship with technology. Like technology has always been a thing, right? But people weren't, and this is a point that Patrick Deneen makes in his book Why Liberalism Failed. He says, I thought it was pretty funny. He says like people back in the day they weren't like to paraphrase, they weren't soy boying over the horse collar. Like new agricultural stuff was being introduced, but they didn't their lives weren't revolved around it. They weren't like infatuated with it in the way that we're infatuated with technology today, and the way that in a lot of ways, if a lot of these like machines went away, or like, the couple people who know how to who actually know these machines, if that all went away, like we probably couldn't rebuild.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I mean by a bubble. Like, even but it goes all the way down, like, even something like you can imagine, like, someone who's alone in the woods, and all that they have is, like, a knife. And if they, like, wound up at the top of a mountain and the knife somehow slipped out of their hands and fell in this crevice in the rock, like, that they would be that's a bubble, and they've just, like, been exposed to all these different issues, and then now you lay all these other layers on top of that, like, the let's say even, like, all the way up to industrialization, and then you have, like, the factory that mass produces goods, and then automobiles and computers, and you just keep layering these more and more and more and more. It's like the bubble grows that much bigger, and its skin becomes that much thinner. And when it does, or if it, well, I think it's inevitable, but when it does collapse, or when it is unable to provide for itself, or we're unable to provide for that degree of technology, it's going to be so much more worse than if we had just been satisfied with a lower level.
I think there's also something to sort of bring it back to our capitalism discussion that we had, and sort of merging these two together, is that the increasing fragility that we have. So capitalism demands more and more and more. One person does something, so you have to, like, one competitor does something, so you have to sort of one up them or keep in pace. So you have increasing optimization, but with increasing optimization, that means that there's more sort of links, there's more things that can go wrong, and therefore with more optimization, you get more fragility, and that makes your societies more prone to collapse.
Mm. Yes, yeah, the interconnectivity of everything, to where I don't go dispose of my trash. I have someone else do that because the technology exists to where that can happen, but only if someone mans it. So it's yeah, yeah, absolutely. The interconnectivity means that everyone's separated from the totality of experiences that are necessary to maintain the status quo.
And this is a point that like Chad Haig makes, where he mentions how when people turn on their water fountain, unless you're like a tradesman of some sort, like a plumber, let's say, they don't understand. They think of like them turning on the water, an infinite pool of water that it's connected to, and just by magic, more or less, or science magic, because they don't believe in magic, of course. It comes
Right,
out. It just comes out. Right. They don't understand all the infrastructure that has to go into it, all the filtration, all the underground connections, everything that has to go into this. Maybe perhaps it even comes from a man-made lake.
right.
They don't understand what they just see, an infinite source of resources that's just coming out, and they don't understand the interconnectivity of this all. And then, so let me ask you this: talking about Chad Haig, what do you think about like the idea of like peak oil? Do you have any like thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, especially right now with everything going on. I have not read his book on peak oil, but I did find that in relation to what you were just saying with his with the thoughts on, like, the infinite amount of resources. I think that Chad Haig, like, nails it on the head when he's talking about, like, the different basically archetypes of memes that society has, and we have the one of progress, where everything has to be constantly progressing. It seems like resources are infinite because we're constantly progressing. I think that idea is, like, fundamental to like, my own intellectual evolution. Like, that I think that he really expressed that like, perfectly. Whereas prior societies had, like, the horizon or a flat line of stability as their
Or even the
as
eternal return,
yes,
like the
yeah,
circle?
yes. And that, I mean, that's something that I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but Dugan, I mean, I think that there's a little bit of overlap between them, especially with regards to time, where it's all these different social um preconceptions about phenomenon in reality are conditioned by like one or two what I call spiritual like assumptions or their
And what are
belief.
those assumptions?
I'm sorry, what?
What are those assumptions, do you think?
Like for us now in the contemporary world,
Yeah.
I would say like the fact that reality is material and that from that it's quantifiable. Everything in reality is quantifiable. I think that that's probably one of the biggest memes that we have because from that you get science, and as an economic extension of that, you get capitalism because money is the base unit of the economic reality, and there's no abstract or there's no function that cannot be explained in materialistic terms. I think that that's a very
And
it
that
is.
also leads to, like, demystification, and then you can't have a demystified society because society is fundamentally built off myth. I think you make that argument, and I would make the same.
Yes, and I do think that society does have a myth. It's just poorly constructed because it
Or it's
is
like the
so.
myth of no myth.
In a lot of ways, yeah. It in a lot of ways, yeah. It's just very, and it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. It's like a socially constructed one where everyone kind of realizes that it's fake and there's no mystery to it, and that there is no there will be an answer for everything according to our foundational spirituality. Like there is an answer to everything, and it's
Yeah, I was even thinking about this. A friend let me borrow this book on Carl Jung, and I was reading it, and he sort of like in a way like deconstructs myths in a lot of ways, like breaks them down into these sort of like units. And I was thinking like this stuff like has to be like banned and like a future society because we can't have like and I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but you can't read someone demystifying a myth, right? Because then it no longer you can only believe in it sort of like ironically, it seems like, like sure you can have like a certain like priestly class who can read it and understand it perhaps, but man, I don't know if like Carl Jung can be read for the masses in a future society, or even like Jordan Peterson like maps of meaning, like this has to be like guarded secrets that people just don't know.
no, absolutely, yeah. I would have to be like not even like the priest class, but like a separate tier of the priest class has access to those texts. And yeah, it's like the inner circle of the priest class would only know about that. Absolutely, yeah.
We're going back to Plato a bit here.
Yeah, well, yeah, honestly, I mean, yeah, it's all built on him. Like ultimately,
Oh gosh. And so I forgot what we were talking about. Did you have anything else?
no, I mean, I'm just kind of fanboying about Chad Hayden, but yeah, that's about that's I agree with him on most points. And I think that his understanding of those fundamental assumptions is absolutely valid and correct.
Yeah, there is actually an interesting on Dugan's website. I think it's like geopolitica.ru or one of those websites. There is a interesting critique that Dugan doesn't make it, but I think it's one of his like associates or someone like related to him, at least related enough to be on his website, where they go into a quite like in-depth critique. I mean, it has to be like I don't know, maybe like 10,000 words or so of Chad Haig's ideology or his sort of philosophy, where they have a lot of respect for it, but they critique it from like an interesting aspect. I feel like
What's the
that might
aspect that you take it from?
basically that it's essentially the aspect that Chad Haig like he just rediscovered the logic of capital, but he calls it the logic of oil.
Huh. Hmm. Okay. Interesting.
But in a lot of ways, I mean, I guess you could say, well, the logic of capital is the logic of oil.
Right. And I think Chad Haight would probably say that because there has to be the energy source for whatever society you have, and in this case, it's just oil.
Yeah, we can talk about that for a while. That's a whole different topic here. So moving on, there's some other things that I wanted to talk about in the book as well, because as I said, there was a lot of like different things that you hit on here. So let me see here one second. So you also could talk about like elite theory a little bit and what our elites like should be doing and whatnot. Do you want to talk? Do you have any comments you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I have my book out in front of me. Let me flip through it to remind. I wrote the thing, and I can't remember everything about it.
Yeah,
Let
that's
me.
specifically in like chapter like 17.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I gotcha. So I do come from a very elitist point of view. I think that, like I was saying again, with a sort of primordial level of civilization, you it's more reliant on the people at the top that, maybe 5-10% of the population than it is on the rest of the population, because without them there is no way to understand the nuance of the situation and what it actually calls for. And throughout the book, I'm talking about, like, the main theme is that the way to survive effectively, let alone thrive, is to better understand reality, and that's truth, is just understanding of reality. And the people who are able to do that best deserve to be in the elite class. And maybe not deserve, that may not be the right word, but it is more beneficial to the society as a whole to maintain order for them to be in the elite class than anywhere else. And we get into how now these people are in like advertising, or they're selling couches or things like that. Like, these people are completely wasted in current society, whereas
Have you seen
before
that?
they
There's that meme. It's like this girl like filming her brother playing it's like a TikTok or something, and he's like all he does is play. Oh, what's that game? Roller Coaster
oh
Tycoon, and listen to classical music. And then like someone commented something like, "Dudes like this used to be running like colonial empires."
yeah, I think I did see that. Yeah. Yeah, that's basically what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at, is that. And I- in this chapter, that um the chapter 17, I kind of go on about, okay, here's the possible things that a society will face, whether it's famine, or whether it's a plague, or whether it's war, or whatever, or like red tape that prevents them from acting in their own interests. And so the only way to best account for that is to create a class of elite people, or to create a class, to select for a class who are the cream of the crop. I mean, without them, like I was saying before, the nuance of the situation, the nuance that each scenario would call for, is going to be lost on who's ever in charge, and they're not going to be able to respond effectively. And everyone who's, it's like, again, the organ of the body, the head, the brain, that is what's making the decisions. And if it's not as healthy and as prepared as it can be, then the entire body will suffer.
What do you think about the idea of sort of like downward mobility? Like the idea that right now we have like upward mobility in the sense that everyone is increasingly becoming richer, everyone is increasingly gaining in power, but you never have those people going back down because you mentioned sort of like feudal monarchical societies, which were historically speaking, there's really nothing more stable than like European like feudal monarchies, right? But a lot of that, I would argue, comes from the fact of downward mobility, where only like the firstborn son or the firstborn inherited everything, right? Whereas everyone else, then they had to go join the military, they had to go be priest, they had to go join like the middle class in like the cities or whatever,
Hmm.
like the burgeoning middle class. So from a sort of like evolutionary perspective, where if you believe that the people with good genes, high IQ, you can even put it in like non-materialistic lenses as well. But I'm just using this because I think it's most familiar to people. If you had people with these good genes, high IQ, they're able to make their way up, but then you have their children, which will have a lot of their similar things, also make their way down to the middle. Then you have a eugenic effect rather than a sort of dysgenic effect going on.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I never really considered that, but that would be possible if you do have families who, and if it is, what would it be, uh, primogenitor societies. Yeah, I can. That's a really interesting idea. I think that would have an overall beneficial effect, because they would be well trained. and they'd be going to these institutions. And plus, it would be effectively, um, it would be a really effective way of maintaining order because you would have these high powerful people doing what the normal people are doing and reporting it back to their cousin or whoever who is in charge of society. That'd be interesting. Yeah.
So I think you in the book you sort of tell me if I'm wrong, but you sort of like dismiss the idea that we can just like go back to monarchy. Was that right?
I don't think I outright dismiss it. Um, I think I so I I don't think that in a modern industrial civilization it's going to be necessarily possible. Um, but I do see, if there is some sort of a liminal event that causes us to lose a lot of the knowledge or ability to like technology that we have right now. I see that as the default social uh, what would you call it, orchestration. Like that's the default way of doing things because it is so effective and it makes so much sense. And so I don't dismiss it. But I do kind of in my in my vision of what we need to better survive. I don't fully embrace monarchy.
Yeah, nor do I. Just to be clear, everyone. And also, I think another problem with monarchy is that it requires um, either it requires like an ecclesiastical structure, either like Catholicism or Orthodoxy. It requires like because in order to have monarchy, you have to have someone above you, i.e., God. And after once we have like the Protestant Reformation, I think both you and me might agree on this point. You sort of have the dissolution of monarchy effectively because you no longer you have this divine right of kings argument, which people say, oh, the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, promoted this idea of the divine right of kings. When in actuality, the divine right of kings argument comes from Protestant monarchs who needed to source their power away from the church, right?
Mm,
But then basically
mm.
you get this sort of then it's no longer like like a feudal monarchy in a traditional sense because if it's divine right of kings, then it's pretty much like a dictatorship. I'm not saying that in like a I'm not saying that in a bad way, but it becomes in a dictatorship rather than like a real like monarchy, which in my opinion requires someone like it requires the church above you.
Yes, yeah, and a lot of ways that ancient societies accounted for that was to just have the monarch be the head of the church, quote unquote church.
Hmm.
Like in Egypt, the pharaoh was basically an avatar of the god, or a god. It
Yeah,
doesn't necessarily have to be Ra or whatever, but a god. And so
yeah.
it's even
But I
one
think the
step
problem though is
further.
now is that like there is no like I don't like I don't think Rome is like an effective way to reinstitute monarchy. I don't think they have the clout or the sort of virility that's needed to like take up that political role. And I think the same can be said of the Orthodox Church as well.
Well, I think, yeah, I agree with that.
And
I
also
think it's
and also everyone would have to agree with that. And I think that's going to be a very, very, very hard thing to come about, realistically speaking. As much as you or me might want that.
yeah, true. And it does go back to the Protestant Reformation, which is it's just an issue. It's a hermeneutical issue almost more than it is like a religious issue. It's just almost like a denial of authority beyond the self, which led to individualism.
Yeah, I think me and you both agree heavy there. But then going back to the sort of alternatives, because I don't think monarchy is realistic. Because even if we physically could, again, it sort of comes back to like you would have to like ironically believe in it because you basically just have to have some guy just instate himself as the monarch, and we all agree, oh yeah, we're all like Bonnerites, we're all loyal to like the Bonnerist throne or something like that, right? And it just doesn't. I don't maybe because our world is so deracinated that and I demystify that I can't see that happening in the future. But I think a more pragmatic way to the future is like a one party state, something along the lines of like the Chinese model. What do you think about that?
I would agree, and that's more totalitarian, and therefore it better allocates the promulgation of order. But I see I do so in the book, or at least in the appendix B of the book. I lay out kind of like a blueprint, like constitution, hypothetical constitution for a hypothetical country, where there is one leader, and he is effectively a monarch. I call the leader the archon, and he is chosen by the preceding archon. So instead of it being familial or genetic or anything like that, it's a person has to gain citizenship, and then they stand to be selected by the archon as a replacement. And this system is held up by some sort of hypothetical religious justification.
Because even in like the Chinese model, what you have a lot of purges going on, right? Like very few people survive until they're no longer necessarily like killed, but they are purged from the party once a new premier. I think that's what they call their head of state. Once the new premier comes in, there's like, these like massive purges. Because unlike in a democracy, you can I know like the two-party system is more or less fake, but there are some aesthetic differences between the Republicans and the Democrats that are interesting, and they do, for the most part, want their guys in there at least for partisan reasons, at least to benefit their specific party. But
Mhm.
but we can argue, of course, that the teleology of the two parties are more or less the same. But anyways, democracy gives them a sort of formal and quote unquote legitimate method to remove everyone from the former administration and put in their guys. But with a like a one party state or like a dictatorship of some sort, the only way to do that is through like killing people or like exile or something along those lines, like bullying someone out of their position.
Right, yeah, basically. And we talked about that a little bit before, is that, that's how the Strasserites got kicked out of the entire, NSDAP structure, is through something similar to that.
Yeah, yeah, right. Because even then, you have to basically kill people to remove them because just because there's no other mechanism to do that. So I do think that there needs to be like formalized. I think you have a good idea that there does need to be some sort of formalized line of secession. That way, it's not decided through like bloodshed,
Right, and that's
and
and
that
that's
can easily cause instability.
and yes, yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that the only way to do that isn't, like, this is my son sort of situation, is for to kind of like use the model of the five good emperors of Rome, where they more or less chose someone who they felt could be weaned into this position. Because if it is your son, or if it's you child, gender neutral term, if it's your child who you're raising into this position, they are going to have different expectations, and they're not going to be able to respect the role, I don't believe, as much as someone who has felt at least a little bit that they've earned it, or that they came from a different situation, and now they have to, and now they have this responsibility. And I do think that there are benefits to the like genetic line of succession, but I feel like those benefits also have serious negative um, attributes that can be negated through a chosen successor rather than a birth successor.
And I think there's another problem, like like Hans Hermann Hoppe, his sort of critique of democracy, which you sort of bring up. I don't know if you mentioned this specific critique, but it's this idea of like a time horizons where if you're like an elected official for like 4 years, you don't necessarily have that much incentive to worry about long-term planning or long-term strategy because you're just concerned about getting reelected, and then you can't be, at least in the American system, you can't be reelected after that if you're the president, so then you can just kind of do whatever, and if you screw up the economy, oh well, you're going to be rich through like egregious speaking, getting paid like $30,000 for like a 1 hour speech, and then you don't have to suffer any more political consequences, so you don't really have an incentive to plan long term. But and then Hoppe argues that monarchies were able to negate that because you were in there for life, and then they had an incentive to keep the kingdom stable even after the lifetime because of their children who they felt a specific connection to. Which I think he's right in that aspect, but I think a way to solve that is through the one like an ideological one party state, right? Where it's like, oh, I am doing this for my people. I want to create a long-term strategy that works for my people in the sense that the top can feel connected with the bottom.
Right. Yeah. I
And I
agree,
think
and
with
I
monarchies, you don't really see that, right? I mean, the only reason why they want to create long term stability is because of like religious obligations or because of their family and whatnot. However, if you can create both a sort of religious or mystical of some sort obligation, as well as an obligation to protect their people, and even like an ideological obligation where it's like, I want to continue to reify this ideology, which I believe is correct. I think that's even a more powerful incentive than monarchies, which historically speaking, the way they viewed themselves was as like a sort of like I don't not necessarily a different race of people, but like a different people altogether. That's why incest for them was more or less legalized, while incest for the lower people or the non-nobility wasn't really allowed. I think even in Western Europe, like it was the incest prohibitions were like insane. I mean, like it had to be like fifth cousin or more. Like you couldn't even like marry your fourth cousin, which if you live in a small village, like pretty much everyone's your fourth cousin at least.
right. And yeah, to get to what you were saying about the Chinese system, another interesting aspect of it, not only is that it one party, which allows it to have a more focused um, collective consciousness, it allows it to be more and less like a constant state of civil war almost. But the Chinese system is also tiered to where access into a higher branch of government is incumbent upon your access to a lower tier of that, and you can't just rise from the bottom to the top immediately. Like in the U.S. system, you could take any random person off the street, and hypothetically, they could be elected president just if they get the right.
Like Donald
Uh,
Trump, right?
exactly right. Someone who has zero political experience, just someone who is able to gain consensus among the people, which is way more destabilizing, excuse me, than someone who has steadily worked their way up, like Xi Jinping. Not that just as a means of communicating that that system is much more stable and it is much more earned than Western democracy and what the Chinese call centralized democracy.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the best democracy in like the proper sense is not rule by numbers, not rule of the 50.1% against the 49.9%, but rather it's a more ethereal idea of like the general will, where you're enacting the people's will, not like the numerical will.
Yes, yes, and I think another aspect that I have I have a lot of respect for is that there are consequences after your term is up. Like and I think this dates back to feudal China, where the legalistic school of thought would have like reviews, a very meritocratic system, and they would review your performance after your time serving the people was done and say, okay, based off these metrics, you did a good job, or based off these metrics, you did a bad job, and here's your punishment. So it wasn't just like, my time in office is up, peace out, I'm done. There were actually consequences that you had to think about while you were in office.
Well, I didn't know that. That's interesting. I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, and especially under Xi Jinping, they've been enforcing that, and they've been changing a lot of the standards to be more strict.
Well, I know even in China, if you're like a billionaire, they're not like scared to like put a bullet in your head as well.
Right? Yeah, yeah. Jack Ma, I think. Yeah,
And there's even been some others as well, or maybe not like billionaires per se, but like multimillionaires. So they're not they're not scared to say, hey, if you are like acting not in the interest of the people, maybe we'll not kill you, but we'll nationalize your business and make it so that it is in the will of the people.
correct. Yeah, and that's that higher like higher like greater than the market that allows them to actually make the most out of the market. Now, to do that, they've been given their people like comparatively horrible working hours and horrible working conditions, but it's in service of this greater goal. And
Well,
so
I wouldn't
they're
argue that it's like any worse than like America was in like say like the Gilded Age or something along those lines.
I agree, I agree, I agree. But it's more unlike the Gilded Age. It's focused towards a goal, which I think will ultimately lead to the I won't say the liberation of the worker, but I will say like better working conditions, better overall social circumstances, because they will have achieved economic victory globally, and at that point they can, maybe not rest on their laurels, but they will have achieved their goal that the generations now and before have been working towards, and
Yeah, and
that's
also
because
like the
they have that
Chinese. Like I don't
social.
want to talk too much about the Chinese, but they have a civilizational concept of themselves that a lot
Correct.
of
Yeah.
people in the West really, even most of our leaders don't really have. I don't think anyone in the West really has that. I think most of our elites in the West just outright hate us,
Yeah. I mean, there is
especially
there
the
is
ones with the big noses and the small hats. They hate us on like a theological level, metaphysical level. They're like repulsed by looking at us.
and yeah, I agree. There's a sense of Han supremacy almost, but I do talk about that issue of our current elite in the book, and I've tried to I try to use the book as a way to build up to that as well. I don't. The book is structured in a way where I'm not just trying to like throw the conclusions at the reader at the forefront, and this is why I think it's important for people who are just now getting into our sphere of things to read, is that it's a steady walk through step by step of, okay, this has a foundation which leads to this, which leads to this, and if you look at all these different conflicting interests, it only makes sense if these are the elite, or and everything builds one block on top of each other until you have a structure that you can use to create an orthodoxy from.
Yeah, and I think that yeah, I think that's very important. But I do feel like in a lot of our spheres, in you and me in our sort of like broader political sphere, is that there is a huge vein of anti-intellectualism that goes on. Not in the sense of like, oh, I don't read. I just want to, like work out and like, donate money. I mean, if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm not saying like you have to read, but there is a huge vein of anti-intellectualism where you, I'm not necessarily not made fun of, but it's said that doing intellectual stuff is counterproductive. These people make this argument that this is like counterproductive. But me personally, I take the line that this might get me in trouble, but I take the line that Karl Marx says in the sense that ideas and thoughts are dialectically interlinked. You cannot have one without the other. Bad thoughts lead to bad actions.
Correct. Yeah. And yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. And
Like, and there's also like a reason why, why does if intellectualism doesn't matter and it's just like some nerdy book club thing that no one cares about, then why did the CIA fund the Congress for Cultural Freedom? Why do they fund postmodern this like modern art or postmodern art or whatever? Why do they fund all these people? Why did the US fund Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe or whatever? Why do they fund all these like intellectuals and like other governments and other universities and all that? That's because ideas matter.
yeah, I completely agree with
It's not
that.
just about hard power. Soft power matters, and to take a line from Sun Tzu, win via to win via soft power only is the greatest victory you can achieve.
Yeah, I'm 1000% on board. I don't think, again, it goes back to the whole thing. If you don't have the most adept 5 to 10% of your population, if you don't have them as strong as they possibly can be mentally to like I keep saying this, but to perceive the nuance of the situation. Now they necessarily don't have to tell the lower, I'll say classes, but I just mean the rest of society. They don't necessarily have to tell them the nuance, but they do have to understand the nuance to activate correct action. And it's think about it like the propaganda, like a class of people who make propaganda, or who would instruct the people who would make the propaganda, like even a higher level. Like
And
that's
also, just like historically speaking, my question to these sort of like anti-intellectuals: name me one movement that got into power and was successful that had anti-intellectualism in it. If you read about like the rise of the Italian fascists, for instance, Mussolini was like editor of a newspaper. He was very well read in like Hegel, and even in his like writings, he's obviously very well read philosophically. The debates about socialism, um, national syndicalism, nationalism, all these like nuanced debates. He was very, very well read, right? And the same thing. I don't know if people have read the book. Brendan Sims's new book on Adolf Hitler, our favorite Austrian painter. He makes the argument that he only wanted to leave the party so that he could maintain ideological orthodoxy. And the ideological orthodoxy for him was very important. Like ideas were important for him. Like if he wanted to get power, if he was just about power, then he could have joined any other mainstream party. But instead, he basically started in a party that had just a couple of people in it and worked his way up rather than joining an established party instead. Because they were very motivated by ideas. These people were very intellectual. There hasn't been any, to my knowledge, any real successful anti-intellectual or just non-intellectual like political movement in the past couple hundred years, at least I can think of. And I would even argue that societies of the past, they weren't necessarily like ideological in the sense that we in the modern postmodern world understand it, but they replace ideology with their version of ideology in the sense that I'm talking about was theology
Right,
or
right.
some sort of cosmology of some sort.
And even
Sorry, that
like
was
the
a bit of a
American.
rant there, but that's my 2 cents on that.
No, no, yeah, I think it's completely accurate. And even the American Revolution, you look at the figures in that, like
Oh yeah.
Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, like these are basically just these guys just devoured any sort of contemporary philosophy.
Even
And
Alexander Hamilton, I remember reading like there's like an anecdote about the early after the Revolutionary War, after they established the presidency, the Congress. Alexander Hamilton was the Treasury Secretary or something like that, and
yeah,
the Congress like basically asked him to write a report about what they should do. And in like the span of just like a few weeks, Alexander Hamilton like by hand wrote like a 30,000 word book about what the new economic system should be.
That's,
The
I
world
never
is
heard
conquered through ideas because myths and symbols are ideas, and that is what controls us fundamentally in a lot of ways.
Yes, yes, I agree. It's the justification for action. Like no one, and it's the contextualization of reality into a form that can be understood and acted upon. Like otherwise, like what Jordan Peterson would say, it's just a bunch of chaos that you're having to confront. But without the contextualization of reality through the kind of things that you're talking about, there's no way to act, let alone properly act for your own effective sorry excuse me effectual um, survival.
I think we can just a real quick tie into our Protestant discussion. You just said context is important. Maybe that's why part of the Protestants get things wrong because lack of context. But I know I probably triggered some people by saying that.
Proddy's in the chat.
I know I have some Protestant friends that I'm good friends with here who probably got triggered by that. But okay, um, I want to talk about now. Sort of moving on. You have this interesting. Actually, let me just read this quote that I really liked from your book. So this is towards the end. You say, "If we value beauty, then we are at war against those who make the world ugly, and if we are at war, then we must act accordingly." So you have this sort of I'm not saying it's not very dense or anything, but you have this you maybe perhaps you outlined this interesting theory of how like aesthetics and morality are sort of interrelated with each other. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah, so the discussion on like aesthetics as morality or vice versa that happens in the book is like it is towards the end, and the whole book before that is kind of walking through the perceived limitations or proclivities or negatives of human history and human nature until it gets into the modern world, and all of the detractions, all of the waste and the depotentialization that happens from that. That's it's after that I start talking about, okay, well, if we want to like figure out how we're supposed to react to this, like it doesn't the book just doesn't just end with like everything's horrible. It's like, okay, if everything's horrible, like why and how can we properly react to that? And so I kind of formulate a few key points about like our behavior or how to gauge the effectiveness of our behavior. And so I say that there's like four conditions that we have to respect. So there's reality itself, that there is like truth in existence, and then of that existence, we have a specific human nature. And then, as an expression of that human nature, we belong to a specific cultural milieu. And then within that cultural milieu, we have our own personal scenarios that we face. So there's these four things: reality, human nature, culture, and then the personal things, like our own interests and situations that we face. And so, how can we balance those, or how can we act in accordance with those to where we're not overvaluing one over another? And I think this is, just kinda as an aside, I think this is why nihilism or philosophies like that are culture, or not culturally, excuse me, intellectually bankrupt, is that they're just basically valuing reality like the highest possible thing above everything else, whereas there's these other facets that we belong to that they're just not respecting. But that's the aside. So with all those different facets that we belong to, I don't think that we can account for good behavior, or not good behavior, but effectual behavior through rules, because there's so many different scenarios. Like if you were to make a rule book of every rule of every scenario you'd face, it'd be just too long. And then on top of that, every action that we take has, like, hypothetically infinite number of consequences through time. It's like a massive ripple that just never ends. So there's all these permutations that we are unknowable. And then there's the possibility of one of those permutations being a quote unquote mistake, where our existence is depotentialized, where we've not been able to respect the different forces at play. And so we have to waste time to course correct. And so there's no authoritative measure or set of standards that we can use to gauge if we've made a mistake in this big chain. So we have to appeal to more qualitative measurements for effectual or ineffectual behavior. I think that the best qualitative measurement is to view our actions through an aesthetic lens. Um, and the aesthetics is that it's, to me, it breaks down kind of simply. It's just, if there's our actions, if you view them as a creation, we were creating consequences. We wouldn't make something deliberately that's ugly. And because ugliness is some sort of like unrealized potential or flaw or something like that. So if we're just trying to create good things, if something winds up ugly, then it's obviously something, some essence wasn't realized. And at the same time, if something is beautiful, then it's difficult to say that it has an underlying negativity or a flaw to it. Like if something is beautiful, then how are you to judge that as a negative thing? And again, this is a qualitative measurement. There's no quantitative or way to do this. This is just more instinctual.
So
Or
you're saying that like beauty is essence properly realized, or like a, maybe even like a teleology properly realized or effectively realized, whereas a ugliness is essence, the essence of something ineffectually realized, or like improperly realized or utilized.
more or less, yes.
Okay.
And I that is again, it's kind of platonic in a way, because it would naturally follow that there's like forms or ideas, like a hypothetically perfect horse or whatever, like, use a platonic example. But um I do think that we do sort of do that in our own heads, though, like, in terms of what we've interacted with or what our culture has quote unquote programmed us for. There are definitely standards of beauty that, perhaps in the Middle East, they may not resonate perfectly with me, but I do understand their sense of beauty, and that's because of their culture. And the more that you understand the culture, the more you will appreciate the beauty, because that is one of the components um understanding what sort of context we act in, reality, human nature, culture, and in our own individual circumstances. But sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, so do you think that like beauty and ugliness is at least for specific instantiations of it, do you think it can be somewhat subjective?
I think it
Like, or at
can.
least like maybe like culturally subjective?
I think so. I think even individually subjective to a certain extent, but not to the extent that your our view of beauty is going to be so radically different that when two different people, like, it's not to the extent that modern society would say that it is in that way.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying like, just a sort of extreme example that I'm thinking of, and tell me what you think about this. Is let's say you have again, I'm not a very like just kind of bear with me here. Let's say you have like a hunk of metal, and your city is like under siege, right? And you can either make, let's say you make like a statue. Let's say you make like a beautiful like metal statue, right? But it's in the middle of a siege, rather than make it into some sort of weapon of some sort. Under normal circumstances, you might say, okay, yes, using that metal to make this beautiful statue is a great thing. It adds to our cultural heritage, it adds to our cultural virility, unites us, all this stuff. But maybe in this specific circumstance, when like materials to make weapons is running low, it can be that statue can actually be ugly because it's improperly realized to defend your civilization or defend your city or whatever. That's just something that I thought of. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I can't really argue against that. I mean, it's very, it's if you do hold that standard to an extreme, then yes, you will find yourself in a situation where you're like making a statue in the middle of a war. But I think ultimately it's about our behavior, our actions, where we're trying to better realize the consequences of our actions. And I d- I think that in that situation, if you've lost the game that much, or you lost sight of the consequences of your actions that much, then you know there is like a sense of humor to it, like, and like there is like a Diogenes level absurdity to it. But I think that if you've lost sight of the goal, which is effectively like effectual use of our time, which is our existence, then survival would be the higher prerogative there. And again, like I said earlier, like our as a social predator, our human nature reaches out towards warfare as one of the
But also survival, though, right? Because
right.
we want to propagate our own, like our own kind, our own species, our own tribe. Whatever level. At some level, you want to propagate yourself, and I feel like there are there is a certain class of people, and this is even a very Christian concept as well, where there's the commandment to go forth and multiply, right? That can mean have children, right? However, it's not like a monk or some sort of celibate person like Saint Paul wasn't in violation of that commandment because he didn't have children. Rather, he multiplied through his works, right? He was fruitful through his works, right?
Right, exactly.
So there's different ways that we can like sort of propagate ourselves and our civilization beyond just the mere like sort of crass material like Darwinistic viewpoint.
Right, yeah, and then that's yes, exactly. That's what I'm trying to touch on with not just, there is a level where reproduction is a prerogative for human beings, but there's also different functions as a social predator where that nature is better realized. There's not just one way to be a human.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm not saying everyone don't have children or anything. Most people, I think that's um, probably the best course of action. But there are other ways to propagate all of that. So how does this aesthetic moral theory sort of go into the political?
Well, it's so the once you've established that aesthetics is a or excuse me, that morality is an aesthetic prerogative. To me, I also expand on it and talk about how if you're trying to have a aesthetic understanding, again, you have to get to truth of the situation that you face and of what's actually happening. And but to do that, you can't just grab truth out of the ether or like rationalize it through pure reason alone. Like you, again, you have to get back to a spiritual authority, which is a religious function, and that's most people just substitute whatever their cultural um whatever their culture is, says that authority is. So to me, morality is a spiritual function because aesthetics cannot be fully understood unless there is an authority to base truth off of, which has to be spiritually derived. But on top of that, or excuse me, stemming or leading to that, I don't think that you can have any sort of freedom without strength, and strength has to come from preparative training, which is a moral function. You know, that is a way of behavior and of actions and their consequences. So ultimately, to me, um, spirituality leads to our awareness of truth, which leads to morality, which I believe is can be understood through an aesthetic appreciation, which leads to a strength, virtuous action, which leads to freedom. So the politics of the situation cannot create freedom. Freedom has to come ultimately at the end of this chain through a spiritual awareness. And the only thing that the state can do to achieve freedom is to create a society that is strong. But to do that, there have to be other, you know, there has to be a moral system, and there has to, from that, there has to be an awareness of truth. From that, there has to be spiritual understanding. So the political system must incubate that and create as strong of a population as possible, eugenically or however, mimetically, both ideally, so that there can be a sense of freedom in the population and freedom in a predatory sense, not freedom in a like domesticated sense, because we are again social predators. So that's how I view this affecting and being affected by the political.
Someone just commented, reminds me of Political Theology by Carl Schmitt. Are you familiar with that work at all?
I'm familiar with Schmidt, just not that particular text.
It's a pretty short text. It's more or less like a long essay. I recommend reading it. He basically argues that um, theology, or like the structure of theology, influences like the structure of politics. So like deism, like I don't want to go too much into it, but like this idea of like the proliferation of like deism and the decline of like Catholicism and other like sort of Christianities led to like liberalism.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I completely agree with that. Or maybe Schmidt agrees with me. But I again, it just goes back to that, the, you know, the elite intellectual, and nowadays it would be intellectuals, but in the past it would be monks or religious thinkers. They're the ones who are ultimately contextualizing reality that the rest of society operates from. So it is it yeah, I don't see it as a bottom up. I do see it as a top down understanding.
Yeah, but I guess the problem becomes with like mass literacy. There becomes like a huge problem, right? Where it's like everyone is now can just get their own ideas, especially through the internet. Everyone can just get their own ideas. Um, and there's no sort of like I think the question of like post modernity is, or one of the questions of our sort of era is how do we have meta contextualization in the era where everyone can contextualize everything themselves.
Yes, yeah, that's a big issue. I would say that the invention of the printing press was just as like it unleashed just as many bad like side effects as the internet, like Facebook. It destabilized things to the same degree. But like what Russia's doing right now with the like trying to, or what they're being forced to do, based off of the West behavior, where they're being cut off from all this information. To me, that's a positive socially, because the less information that the general public has, um, the better. I mean, it just cuts out the white noise. And there, you would, if you are going to make a more stable, orderly society, that is absolutely like one of the top priorities is to filter information to only what is necessary and useful. And this is not like necessary. I think people, especially
It sounds
because
like you're trying to apply for like to be one of Plato's guardians right now.
well, it's because like when I woke up from this deep sleep, he told me I had like bronze genetics. Like no, it's absolutely necessary. It's whether and it's not necessarily a negative thing. Like I think because of democracy and probably the internet and printing press and things like that, people view it as inherently negative when there's information being withheld because they think there's some sort of secret that you're trying to keep and you're working against them. But it can be benevolent and it has been for the past, you know, arguably 10,000 years.
One thing that I think that literacy has like a almost like an ontological effect on people. Like even one of the biggest sort of markers of or one of the biggest factors that goes into like women's fertility, especially in like third world and like kind of like these developing underdeveloped nations, is whether or not women are able to read or not. Like not even like educational level, but just like the ability to read. Like women who are able to read have like significantly lower birth rates than those who can read, even if they're like genetically related to each other.
Yeah.
So I think that even like Plato talked about this, how like reading and like writing is like a poor form of communication because you can just lie,
yeah, yeah, that's
and now like speech and like dialectic in like the traditional like Greek sense of it is like the purest form because you have to like speak from your heart or whatever.
well, yeah, I mean, face-to-face interaction, like there's so many like minutia that you can pick up on and you can tell if someone's lying or you can tell if someone's withholding information or you can intuit that sort of stuff. But with writing, all you have is this, again, it's a hermeneutical issue. You have this uncontextualized spew of information that you're, and the other part is that there's this kind of this like sinister part where you're reading these words in your own, if you read them aloud or in your head, you're still reading them like your own voice. So you're kind of like unwittingly accept some of these ideas because it's in your own voice. Whereas if it's coming from someone else, you can accept that more, you can accept that better.
And I think another there's that old adage, we have unlimited information, but like we're in the age of information, but like we're not in the age of knowledge. We're at rock bottom levels of knowledge. You can go to LibGen, Z Library, archive.org, YouTube, Google, find pretty much any historical fact that you want to in the matter of like minutes at most, right? And if you can't find it, you can email a professor from somewhere and he'll get back to you within like a day or so with information. We have access to basically unlimited facts and information, but we don't really have knowledge in any real sense of it. And I think as we talked about with the internet, you create these not even like subcultures, but you create these like micro cultures where it's like some dude with like 500 followers has his own like ecosystem on Twitter.
Yeah.
I think Paul Scalise said, he's a guy on Twitter I like. He said, it used to be you had your 15 minutes of fame. Now you're famous to like 15 people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
So I think one way to solve this because I don't think we need to have like deliteracy programs or anything like that. Um, I think that's like just not going to pan out in whatever way. I think another thing we need to do is just create like an ideological superstructure and just reify a superstructure on a civilizational level. I think me and you both agree that this civilizational level should be like the sort of like European diaspora or whatever on a civilizational level, where when we see other information, we just instinctively like reject it, and we create our own sort of civilizations that are epistemic, fundamentally epistemic, and they have their own mission, they have their own epistemology to them, their own truth to them. Alexander Dugin said famously to some BBC reporter, "We have our own special Russian truth." We need to make it so people have their own truth, and that when they see, news from elsewhere that's obviously like propaganda, they immediately recognize it and just reject it and create. We had to create I don't know. I don't necessarily know how, but we have to somehow be able in the future to create a meta meta contextualization, a meta story for people to believe in. How we do that, I'm not too sure. I'm 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 not pessimistic, but I'm not the most optimistic about it.
I think a lot of that will come, and this is just me being apocalyptic, but I think a lot of that will come organically, especially as like the modern situation devolves. And I have a very short term pessimistic view of things, but I'm very optimistic long term that an organic sense of things will return. I just don't see like the current situation that we're in right now, especially in the West, especially in America. I just don't see it within our lifetime, within our generation, going. I just see it on a constant downward spiral, and I think that from that there will be a lot of things that we've talked about in the interview, like with technology, with information, and with political structures and economic systems. I think a lot of that will, by necessity, be issued by everyone, and you'll have to get more local. You will have to be um, you'll have to be reliant on the people around you, and that the people around you will have a different understanding of the world than the people 50 miles away from you. And that's just the way that's what the cycles I was talking about before, that seems to be the trend, is that when these central authorities, political authorities, collapse, they're unable to allocate resources to the localities they control. Then those localities have to pick up the pieces. And whichever factions are able to do that most effectively, especially nearer the collapse of central authority, whichever factions are able to do that more effectively are the ones who wind up creating the new mythos. And it happens organically. I don't know how consciously it will have to happen, but I do think that there does have to be, at least beforehand, to create a faction, there does have to be a conscious recognition of the situation we face and the vision of what we want to create. And if there's not orthodoxy in that ahead of time, then we can't effectively create a faction that can weather the collapse to come and come out the other side as the new elite.
You make a good point towards the end of your book, sort of about this that I want you to elaborate more on. You mentioned how I guess like that book, Siege by Mason, talks about how when there's a collapse of like the government, then our side will just automatically win or whatever. So, what do you think about if there is a sort of like institutional collapse? Realistically, what does that look like, and what is our sort of, in broad strokes, our best outline or our best plan for the future to be successful?
Well, I think, and I wrote a little bit more about this in the firstness article about the ancient Egyptian collapses that happened. I got a little bit more in depth because I see, everyone talks about Rome, and yes, there are parallels, especially because it's a Western civilization. But to me, the what's more accurate is this second intermediate period of Egyptian history, where after the central power collapsed, the central dynasty was unable to, you know, allocate resources. It wasn't able to have a coherent line of succession, etc. You have this group of people, the Hyksos, who had beforehand set up their people in the Nile Delta, basically run rampant throughout the whole Nile. And I kind of equate this to like imagine it like ancient Mexicans in a lot of ways, like Mexicans from the Levant. And I do see something similar happening here with like the cartels just sweeping through the southern part of the US. But regardless of that parallel, it's the localities, like these city states, that were forced to actualize whatever soft power their local factions or local bureaucracies had ahead of time. Um, there was infighting among the factions, especially in like Thebes, which was very far south of the on the Nile. Like I see that happening in the US too, where there's going to be a lot of infighting, and um there's going to be a lot of like gray area, and there's probably going to be a lot of horrible things that have to be done. But I don't see any historical precedent for the contrary. And when these central powers collapse, it's not immediate, and there's no guarantees that in anything. Um, but it's the only way to make sure that you can survive. And this is something that we have to get rid of ahead of time with individualism. The only way that you can effectively survive is if you tie yourself to this faction, the tribe. Think of it like a neo tribe that can get resources for you. It's not just the goons who are going to win this. It's the people who have resources, and these are just normal people. These aren't, it's not necessarily like the most right wing philosopher ever. These are just normal people who have resources and who are willing to act. That's the most important thing. But if you don't get the theory laid out ahead of time, then the action's going to be, um, it's going to succumb to someone who a different faction who does have the theory laid out. And I just see like eventually things will coagulate to where like a locality will have one faction who's who effectively determines what's going on in there, and that's their territory. And you'll have different territories spring up too. And I'm sure that the U.S. system will not completely collapse. It's just that they won't be able to effectively police certain areas. Like maybe there's a city like in Montana or somewhere, or Kansas, or just somewhere where the federal government, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist. And over time, these localities will build up power and they'll confederate. And I see it happening. I can envision it because it's happened so many times before in history, and I see that what our sphere does will play an important role if we're able to establish that orthodoxy, if we're able to gain resources ahead of time and know that we're going to need to use them for these sort of purposes. And look, like if this doesn't happen, if this scenario like this, like eschatological scenario doesn't happen, then um, at the end of the day, you'll just like have a bunch of friends and a bunch of capital to play around with. So to me, that's the way forward, and that's the way that survival is going to be um, actualized.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I think it's like really realistic. I mean, I don't think that it's going to be, the government like collapses, like just one day all of a sudden it collapses, total anarchy, and then we get what we want. Hold up. Sorry, had a sneeze there. I don't think it's going to be, just like James Mason style, but looking at history, I think the best way to sort of see how people gain power, it's a lot of history is random. A lot of it's these random flukes of history that happen. I think the most famous example, most notable example, is like the assassination of the Archduke. Right before World War I, where he fails to shoot him, and then he just happens to go to this one
Right.
sandwich shop, and the Duke's car just happens to get lost, and it just happens to stop in the tracks right there. And history just gave him a second chance by pure luck. Right? History is often decided by these really small and minute things where if just one little thing were to be different, the whole course of history would have changed, right? And we can't affect that. But I think what we can affect though is be ready when, history to personify when history presents itself. When history presents us an opportunity, we have to be ready in order to take that opportunity. But we can't necessarily force history to give us that opportunity necessarily.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, I agree. And it's the sort of like boomerism, like prepper sort of mindset where it's like I'm just gonna sit with folded hands until the collapse happens, and then I'll be able to take my AR and do whatever to survive, like a Walking Dead sort of thing. Like there's this fantasy that people have, and it doesn't benefit us. And like I was saying, if you do accept the conditions that we are at war or we're at least being attacked, by these people who hate us, then you have to act accordingly, and you have to be able to logistically um, account for what you're going to need to do in a military operation. And if you can't logistically account for that, then you've already lost.
Yeah, definitely. Is there any other things that you wanted to bring up real quickly about your book, like other things you talk about, or just like kind of give your pitch for the book again?
Uh, so the elevator pitch is that this sounds like negative. It's not necessarily like a philosophical book. I don't think I'm intellectually equipped to undertake something like that. But also, one of the benefits of that is that it doesn't ascribe to any singular methodological standard, and it's much more applicable to reality, like the situations that people face. And I think the title of the book, Compendious Visions, the visions of the book is the first vision is the past. What has led to the current situation? What sort of weird historical circumstances or proclivities of our nature or ontological arrangements have led to this situation? And then the second vision is of the present, where I kind of dissect what we are existing in, like the everyday experience and what constitutes that. And then the third vision is what the future might be, or what I think it should be if we're able to make it that way. And each one stems from the last, and each chapter stems from observations of the last, to where you can build a sense of orthodoxy from it for our spheres or our movement or whatever you want to call this. But it's also contextualized in a way where someone who's new to these ideas isn't immediately put off. You don't just jump at them with the most taboo subject right at the forefront. You slowly build up to these sort of things to where it's a rational conclusion. And so I think not only for the person who's new to these circles, but I think it would benefit them immensely, but also for the person who's been in these circles and who understands a lot of these ideas. It helps organize it in a way that is you can build a worldview off of, and you can build action from, and hopefully we can realize some of the stuff that I talk about in the later chapters of what sort of things we need to be building and doing now to prepare for the future.
And if you could, what do you actually first off, I don't think this is like a book to like give to your parents per se. It's not
Sure,
like one
yeah,
of the yeah, it's not like one of those types of like introductory sort of stuff. But I think this sort of it looks like your target audience, or I guess your target audience is sort of everyone in this sort of sphere. But I think the people who would benefit the most from this book would be people who haven't necessarily read a lot of like theory, or are relatively new to this, but would like a good starting point. I think this is actually a good sort of like 101 book with regards to that, like theory 101. Like, if someone reads this, then at least they have some foundation of what our struggle is.
yes, yeah. It's not as nuanced as it would need to be for like what I talk about, like a burgeoning priest class to base their things off of. But it is enough to where someone could start doing more research and at least have a foundation of understanding.
And it is very easy to read, and it's very fun to read as well. Uh, I had a very fun time reading it. There's a lot of like little things and whatnot, and it just make it very fun to read, very fluid and all that. And then you do have some stuff at the end about some sort of practical things that we can do. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it just goes. It's the methods are related to the ends. Like the means and the ends, to me, have to align. It's because if the means that we use, um, if they essentially wind up prohibiting the ends, like let's say we want to promote the family, which are, for me, the basic social unit. If we want to promote that, we can't use means that exclude or taint that. So our means have to be similar to the ends, or at least work towards the end, and they can't justify, or the ends can't justify the means is what I'm trying to say. Excuse me. And I think that the ends are tied to the means. And this, I keep going back to the locality. The local scene to me is the only scene that matters. Everything else outside of a 10-mile radius of you might as well not exist for most of your day-to-day life. And so we do need to make an intellectual orthodoxy, and we need to have the theory down. And I think that that's going to be even an international project. But the action that comes from that theory has to be local. And even in like the day-to-day life of the federal government, if they don't have local functionaries, then they might as well not exist. Everything that happens is based off of local areas. And so if you're not in touch with your local power people, and if you're not in touch with your local dissident scene, then you're missing out on what to me is going to be very important in the future during this collapse that we're going through right now. That's where your bread and butter is going to be. Those are the people who you're going to be relying on and who are going to be relying on you. And if you don't build that trust now, you won't have that ability. And so I think we don't even need to be preaching to normal people. We just need to be making connections with these people and with power people. Yes, we need to be telling them the truth about things, but we can't blindside them to the extent that their reaction is going to ostracize us. And to me, the local area, everything that we need to be doing and focusing on needs to be there. We don't need to abdicate any space online or at the national level. We need to be constantly taking ground, because if we are in war, like I think that we are with these global systems that hate us, then the last thing you want to do in war is abdicate any space. I mean, you may take a tactical retreat to reorganize, but your goal eventually is going to be to retake that space. And as a predator, always trying to claim space, and that, I mean, that's a Bronze Age pervert thing, but to me, that's a very critical function of human nature. And that to me is the means. That's the everyday sort of thing. Like if you do actually think some of the things that are in the book, then your actions need to reflect that day every single day. And the only way that that's possible is not by tweeting about it. It's not by waiting patiently for a collapse to happen. It's not about going and kamikazing something. It's by working tirelessly like a zealot every single day towards realizing the creation of your local faction and expanding the potentiality of your resource allocation moving forward. Sorry, that was a little long-winded.
No, no, that was really good. And are there any? Do you have any like sort of like other advice, like more I guess more like pragmatic advice people could like take up here? Like I know one of your things you say, get involved more in your local community, like go to church or get involved in your church or whatnot. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just being friendly to other people who are part of your in group. You know, to other people who are gonna you share an identity with. That's the most important thing, and just being part of your local community to any degree. I think I think that's the most important part, is getting out and doing things. The action, and I say that in the introduction of the book, is that the theory is great because we need the theory to create right action. But if we don't have the action to follow that up, then it's kind of for nothing. And we have to do that. You have to be the zealot. No one else is going to be expected to do that. If you know what's true, you have to act on that.
Was there anything else you wanted to bring up with regards to any of that, or especially with regards to like what our future holds and how we can get there?
Um, not necessarily. I'm kind of at a loss. Flipping through my book right now. I I I I think that there do need to be. I think the creation of businesses is important because that gets you capital and it gets you influence and it gets you connected with people. Businesses are definitely a good way forward. It's probably one of the best ways forward, in my opinion. Not only for your own individual life currently, but for the future too. And just getting out and meeting other people offline. It sounds so simple, but it's the first step towards something bigger, towards like truly our liberation. It's the step forward. It's
I want to read
everything
this.
comes from it.
While we wrap up here, I want to read this. Do you know who Mike Ma is?
Yes, yes.
I want to read this quote that I found. I was having you filibuster for a bit so I could find this quote. But- so this is from his book Harassment Architecture. I'll read, and this relates to what we were talking about. Today, we swear it to ourselves that tomorrow should be wounded, even just a little bit. If every day you take your heartiest swing at the world, you've done your job. Some of us will go for its ankles, its knees, or its stomach. Some of us will go straight for the eyes, the neck, or the heart. Either way, it's all more than anyone will ever do. It's today that you have accepted that you yourself are an engine of chaos, an accelerationist. You architect harassment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's more of like a goon take on it, but yeah,
It's
that's
more.
perfect.
It's a bit poetic, shall we say?
Yeah, let me see. And here's probably this is I could have just found this page originally, and that would have stopped the filibuster. But I say, our cause, us, will need veterans. We will need large families. We will need wealthy financiers. We will need grunts willing to be on the ground. We will need authors and artists. We will need civil servants, farmers, welders, and electricians. We will need teachers and librarians. We will need those familiar with the people they live near. And in general, we need our people to be as successful and connected as possible. We need people with values and skills, not just knowledge and toys. Neither do we need dogmatists. We need human beings. We do not need to explicitly convert people, but simply thrive and build trust by aiding those around us. Go meet people and understand them on their own terms to begin local consolidation.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to sort of end it off here. If you, Jim, let people know how can they find your work and this book specifically, how can they support you?
So
And whatever platforms you're on, you can plug those as well.
I am on Twitter at real underscore Jim underscore Bonner. And you can find my book. I have this most recent book that we've been talking about, Compendious Visions, Discourses on Contemporary Decline, available on Amazon for $9.99. I feel like Robert Seffer, where I need to say it makes a great gift. But there's also a play that I wrote called Interbellum that's also available on Amazon. Um, that's my published work or self-published work. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. I highly recommend this book. It is amazing.
It is indeed. And yeah, it's a great book. I'll make sure that all the links are in the description here. And with that, any other parting words here, Jim?
No, just except that I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. I have incredibly high regard for you and your work, and this is a real treat to get able to be able to talk with you about this. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you again.
Yeah, no problem. All right, everyone. Well, as I said, I'll put the links in the description, and then probably I'll upload this to Odyssey and BitChute as well here in the next little while after it loads and whatnot. And then besides that, I'll see you all guys later.
Thanks again. Good night.